Warning: the Curious Native podcast contains mature topics and themes that are intended for an older youth and adult audience. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hey, welcome to the Curious Native Podcast. I'm your host, hunnasmak, and in today's episode, we will be discussing a deeply serious and sensitive topic: Indian residential schools. The residential school system was designed to forcibly remove Indigenous children from their families and communities, with the goal of erasing their cultures, languages, and ways of life. Over the course of more than a century, thousands of Indigenous children were taken from their families and sent to residential schools across the country. The damages done to Indigenous communities as a result of residential school systems are profound and far reaching. The legacy of the residential school system continues to impact Indigenous people today. In this episode, we will be exploring the history of the residential school system, the impact that it has had on Indigenous communities, and the ongoing efforts to heal and rebuild. I hope that this conversation will help to raise awareness about the important issue and inspire action towards justice and reconciliation. So, if you're interested in what I have to say, please keep listening. What are Indian residential schools? Indian residential schools were a system of boarding schools in Canada that were designed to assimilate Indigenous children into European Canadian culture. The schools were established in the late 19th century and operated until the 1990s. Children were forcibly removed from their homes and their families and were sent to these schools where they were often subjected to physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. The schools were run by the Canadian government and various religious organizations and were part of a broader policy of assimilation that aimed to eradicate Indigenous cultures and traditions. I apologize, I had to close that window. It was just a little too noisy. The legacy of residential schools continue to be felt by Indigenous communities in Canada today, and efforts, not fast enough in my opinion, are underway to promote healing and reconciliation to Indigenous communities affected. The first residential school in Canada was opened in 1831 in Brantford, Ontario, and was run by an Anglican church. The residential school system was created as a larger effort to assimilate Indigenous people into the Canadian society, aka the colonized society. And it was designed to forcibly remove Indigenous children from their families and communities with the goal of erasing their cultures, languages, and ways of life. Over the course of more than a century, thousands of Indigenous children were taken from their families and sent to residential schools across the country. The damages done to Indigenous communities as a result of the residential school system are profound and far reaching. The children were subjected to physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, and many were punished for speaking their own languages or practicing their own cultures. The conditions in residential schools also were, often overcrowded, unsanitary, and children were frequently, malnourished and denied medical care. Many children, died while in residential schools. And many suffered lifelong physical and emotional trauma as a result of their experiences. The residential school system also had a devastating impact on Indigenous families and communities. Children were forcibly removed from their families and communities, and many were never able to return home. This resulted in the loss of language, culture, and traditional knowledge, and it disrupted the intergenerational transmission of knowledge and values. Many Indigenous families and communities continue to struggle with the legacy of residential schools today, including the intergenerational trauma, poverty, and social and economic marginalization that they face. The residential school system was also a part of a larger system of colonialism and oppression that continues to impact Indigenous people today. The forced removal of children from their families and communities was a part of a larger effort to displace Indigenous people off their lands and resource and to take our resources and to force laws and education on us that ultimately was a tool to erase our indigenuity. This has resulted in ongoing injustices, Jesus Christ, and inequalities, including the ongoing theft of indigenous lands and resources, the criminalization of indigenous people, and the ongoing denial of indigenous rights and sovereignty. Despite the devastating impact of residential school systems, indigenous people have shown remarkable resilience and strength in the face of adversity. Indigenous communities continue to work towards healing and rebuilding, and they are fighting for justice, accountability, and the recognition of their rights and sovereignty. As settlers, it is your responsibility to stand with Indigenous peoples and to support their efforts to heal and rebuild. This includes listening to Indigenous voices, learning about Indigenous cultures and histories, and working towards justice and reconciliation. The residential school system in Canada was a government sponsored program that aimed to assimilate Indigenous children into Euro Canadian culture. The system was in place from the late 19th century until the 1990s, and during that time, thousands of Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and sent to residential schools. These schools were often run by religious organizations, and the children were subjected to physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. The exact number of deaths that occurred in residential schools is difficult to determine, as many records were destroyed or lost over time. However, it is estimated that at least 4,100 children were, killed while attending, were killed and, died while attending residential schools. This number is likely an underestimate, though, as many deaths went unreported or were not recorded. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, TRC, which was established in 2008 to investigate the residential school systems, found that the mortality rate for Indigenous children in residential schools was far higher than that of non Indigenous children. The TRC estimates that the mortality rate for Indigenous children in residential schools was between 40% and 60%, which is significantly higher than the overall mortality rate for children in Canada during that time period. The high mortality rate for the high mortality rate in residential schools was due to a number of factors, including poor living conditions, inadequate food and medical care, and physical and emotional abuse. Many children were also subjected to experimentation and medical procedures without their consent, which further increased the risk of death and injury. The legacy of residential school system continues to be felt by Indigenous communities in Canada today. The trauma and abuse suffered by Indigenous children in these schools has also had a profound impact on their families and communities, and has also contributed to the intergenerational trauma and ongoing issues such as substance abuse, mental health problems, and poverty. The residential school system in Canada was a form of cultural genocide that aimed to assimilate Indigenous children into European Canadian culture. The schools were established in the late 19th century and operated until the 1990s, and during that time, thousands of Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and sent to the schools. Children were subjected to physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, like mentioned earlier, and were often punished for speaking their native language and practicing their cultural traditions. The residential school system was a part of a broader policy of assimilation that aimed to eradicate Indigenous cultures and traditions. This policy was rooted in the belief that Indigenous cultures were inferior to European culture, and that the only way for Indigenous people to succeed in Canadian society was to adopt European ways of life. Residential schools were seen as a way to achieve this goal by separating Indigenous children from their families and communities and forcing them to adopt European ways of thinking and behaving. The residential school system was a form of cultural genocide because, it aimed to destroy Indigenous cultures and replace them with European cultures. Children were punished for speaking their native language and were often given European names to replace their Indigenous names. They were also taught European values and beliefs and were forbidden from practicing their cultural traditions. This had a profound impact on Indigenous communities as it disrupted the transmission of cultural knowledge from one generation to the next. The residential school system was also a form of physical and psychological genocide, as many Indigenous children died or were permanently injured while attending the schools. The children were often subjected to physical abuse, including beatings and other forms of punishment as well. They were also subjected to medical experimentation and procedures without their consent, which further, risked. It was they were their lives were putting they're getting put on the line for absolutely nothing. Many children also suffered emotional and psychological abuse, including isolation, neglect, and sexual abuse, which is both a physical and mental abuse. So I just wanted to clarify that at the end. The impact of residential schools on Indigenous communities has been profound and long lasting. Many survivors of residential schools suffer from intergenerational trauma, which is passed down from one generation to the next. This trauma can manifest in a variety of ways. The first lasting impact of the residential school system is the loss of culture and language. Children who were taken from their families and placed in residential schools were often punished for speaking their languages, and they were taught to reject their cultural traditions. This has led to the loss of cultural identity and a disconnect from traditional practices, which has had a profound impact on Indigenous communities. The lasting impact of residential school system is intergenerational trauma. Many survivors of residential schools have suffered from mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, and PTSD, which has had a ripple effect on their families and communities. Children of survivors often experience the effects of intergenerational trauma, including higher risk of mental health issues, substance abuse, and suicide. The third lasting impact of the residential school system is the ongoing cycles of poverty and marginalization. The residential school was a system designed to assimilate Indigenous children into Canadian society, but it failed to provide them with the skills and resources necessary to succeed. Many survivors of residential schools were left without the education and job opportunities necessary to succeed in the economy they were being forced into, which has led to a cycle of poverty, marginalization that continues to this day. After researching for this episode and just learning over the years about colonization and indigenous genocide, one thought that always comes to mind is why? Why would they do this to, indigenous children? Well, for starters, colonizers stole native children for a variety, of reasons, including for assimilation, to assimilate them into European culture, to weaken indigenous communities, to gain control over indigenous lands and resources. The residential school system in Canada was one way that colonizers attempt to achieve these goals by forcibly removing indigenous children from their families and communities and subjecting them to physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. The residential school system was a form of cultural genocide as it aimed to destroy indigenous cultures and replace them with European culture. The residential school system was also a form of physical and psychological genocide as well, as many children died or were permanently injured while attending the schools. Children, like I said earlier, were subjected to physical beating, sexual abuse, mental abuse. It's just like, the impact of residential schools on Indigenous communities has been profound and long lasting. A lot of people who, the victims of these schools, they have PTSD. Another thing I noticed that people don't bring up is the residential school system. It was a way for colonizers to gain control over indigenous children's bodies. Children were subjected to medical experimentation and procedures without their consent, which further increased their risk of death. Many children also suffered this from sexual abuse, which was perpetuated by teachers and other staff members at the school. This abuse was a way for colonizers to exert power over indigenous children and to further erode their sense of self worth and identity. The residential school system was also a way for colonizers to justify their actions to the wider public by portraying indigenous people as savages who needed to be saved from themselves. Colonizers were able to justify their actions as benevolent and necessary. This narrative of indigenous inferiority and European superiority has had a lasting impact on indigenous communities as it has contributed to ongoing issues of racism, and discrimination. The legacy of residential schools is still being felt today. Survivors of residential schools are still grappling with the trauma they experience, and many are still seeking justice for the abuse they suffered. Indigenous communities are still dealing with the intergenerational effects of the residential school system, including poverty, substance abuse, and mental health problems. Reconciliation efforts are ongoing, but much work still needs to be done to address the harms caused by residential school system and to build a more just and equitable society for Indigenous people in Canada. The last residential school in Canada closed its doors in 1996, but the impact of the system is still being felt today. The residential school system was established in the 19th century as a way to assimilate Indigenous children into European culture. Children were forcibly removed from their families and sent to the boarding schools where they were forbidden from speaking their own language, practicing their own religion, or engaging in their own cultural practices. The residential school system was a traumatic and abusive experience for many Indigenous children who were subjected to physical and sexual abuse, neglect, and forced labor. Many children died while attending residential schools, and the exact number of deaths is still unknown. Survivors of residential schools have reported suffering from a range of mental health problems, including depression, anxiety, and post traumatic stress disorder. In 2008, the Canadian government established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission (TRC) to investigate the legacy of residential schools and to promote reconciliation between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous Canadians. Though I don't know if that's their place. They don't. How can you have reconciliation between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people when you aren't even treating your Indigenous people with the respect they deserve, as they are the original inhabitants of the land you are now, call Canada? I just, The final report of TRC, released in 2015, documented the history and impact of residential schools and made 94 recommendations for actions to address the harms caused by residential school systems, which I'm not going to read out the 94 recommendations, as that was a lot. There was so much, and a lot of it, you know, also these residential schools were not exclusive to Canada, as America had its own versions. Indian American boarding schools, also known as Native American boarding schools or Indian residential schools, were a network of boarding schools established in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century. The goal was of these schools was to assimilate Native American children into white American culture by removing them from their families and communities and forcing them to adopt white American custom and practices. The first Indian American boarding schools were established in the 1870s following the passage of the Indian Appropriations Act of 1876. This act provided funding for the establishment of boarding schools for Native American children, with the goal of quote unquote civilizing them and assimilating them into an American society. The boarding schools were run by federal government and various Christian denominations, including the Catholic Church, the Episcopal, I don't know how to say it. It's that church, the Methodist, and the Methodists, sorry. Children were often forcibly removed from their families and communities and sent to these schools where they were forbidden from speaking their own languages, practicing their religion, or engaging in their cultural practices and beliefs. Many children died while attending these schools, and the exact number of deaths is still unknown, but it's likely a lot, and any number we would get is probably an underestimate. So the boarding schools also had lasting impacts on the survivors as well as their families. Many survivors reported suffering from a range of mental health problems, including depression, anxiety, and post traumatic stress disorder. The intergenerational effects of the boarding schools are still being felt in Native American communities today, including in the 1960s and the 1970s. Native American activists began to, speak out against the boarding schools and to demand their closure. In 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed, which gave Native American tribes greater control over the placement of Native American children in foster care and adoption. Today, there are still Native American boarding schools in operation, but they are no longer run by federal government. Instead, they are run by Native American tribes and are focused on providing culturally relevant education and support to Native American children. The legacy of Indian American boarding schools is a complex and painful one. While boarding schools were established with the goal of assimilating Native American children into white American culture, They had the opposite effect of causing lasting trauma and cultural loss and genocide. Today, it is important to acknowledge the harms that were done to Native American children and to work towards healing and reconciliation. Efforts are currently underway to address the legacy of boarding schools. In 2009, President Obama issued an official apology on behalf of the United States government for boarding schools. In addition, the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions of Canada has called for similar efforts to address the legacy of Indian residential schools in Canada. The work of healing, reconciliation, and oh shit, I'm sorry, I misread my notes. The work of healing and reconciliation is still ongoing. Native American communities continue to grapple with the trauma and loss caused by the boarding schools, and efforts are being made to address the intergenerational effects of these schools. In conclusion, Indian American boarding schools were a network of boarding schools established in the United States with the goal of assimilating Native American children into white American culture. The schools were run by the federal government and various Christian dominations, and children were often forcibly removed from their families and communities. Today, efforts are being made to address the legacy of these boarding schools and to promote healing in, in these Native communities that were affected. I do have a list of ways that, Indian residential schools and boarding schools colonized and genocided Native children. So, number one, forced removal. Children were often forcibly removed from their families and communities and taken to the schools. This was done with the intention of breaking down the family and community structures that were seen as obstacles to assimilation. Two, cultural suppression. Native American and First Nation children were often forced to abandon their languages, cultural, and traditions. They were punished for speaking their own languages and practicing their own religions. Three, physical and sexual abuse. Many children in these schools were subjected to physical and sexual abuse by staff members. This abuse was often covered up by the authorities. Malnutrition and disease is number four. The children in these schools were often malnourished and suffered from diseases such as tuberculosis. And five, forced labor. Children in these schools were often forced to work in order to maintain the schools and provide food for the staff. Settlers need to understand the history of residential school system and boarding schools in order to understand the full scope of the harm that was done to indigenous communities. This includes learning about the cultural genocide and forced assimilation, physical and sexual abuse, labor, separation from siblings, lack of medical care, psychological trauma, loss of identity, and intergenerational trauma that resulted from these schools. One of the ways settlers can educate themselves is by reading books written by indigenous authors. There are many books that provide a first hand account of the life in residential schools, such as Indian School, Teaching the White Man's Way by Michael L. Cooper, Stolen Life, The Journey of a Cree Woman by Rudy Weeb and Yvonne Johnson, and Up Ghost River, A Chief's Journey Through the Turbulent Waters of Native History, which is by Edmund Matawabin. I'm pretty sure I did not say that right, but I'm trying. Another way that settlers can educate themselves is by watching documentaries and films about the residential school system and boarding schools. There are many documentaries that provide, a comprehensive overview of the history of these schools, such as We Were Children, Unrepentant Kevin Ennett and Canada's Genocide, and Finding Dawn. Settlers can also listen to Indigenous voices by attending talks and lectures given by Indigenous scholars, activists, and community leaders. In addition to educating themselves, settlers can support Indigenous led initiatives that aim to address the legacy of residential school systems and boarding schools. This includes supporting land back movements, language revitalization programs, and cultural initiatives that aim to preserve and celebrate Indigenous cultures. Finally, settlers can work to dismantle the systems of oppression by, you know, you know, they can. Oh my god, my notes are so messy. Settlers can work to dismantle the systems of oppression that continue to harm Indigenous communities today. This includes supporting Indigenous led movements for justice, such as the movement to end the murder and disappearance of Indigenous women and girls, and the movement to protect Indigenous lands, waters, lands and waters from extractive industries. I apologize, Jesus. To sum this up, I just wanted to say I stand with my fellow Indigenous peoples and offer my support and love to those who have been affected by, the residential school system. I acknowledge, the immense pain and suffering that has been inflicted on Indigenous communities, and I recognize the ongoing legacy of colonialism and oppression that continues to impact Indigenous peoples today. I am committed to learning about other Indigenous cultures and histories and listening to other Indigenous voices and working toward justice and, like I mentioned earlier, reconciliation. I offer my support and love to all Indigenous peoples, and I stand with them in their efforts to heal and rebuild. With that being said, if you like today's episode and would like more like this, please go ahead and subscribe, like, share, and comment to let me know you're enjoying all the hard work and research that goes into these episodes. And if you like me and what I have to say, please feel free to follow my main Twitter page at huskasminitn, and please follow the podcast official Twitter page at TCNPod. Everything will be linked, including all my sources that I use. And with that being said, I'm hunnasmak at the end, aka Huskasmin at the end, aka Nate, and this has been the Curious Native Podcast.